I very much welcome the opportunity to take part in this debate today. Can I begin by apologising for having to leave the Chamber shortly after my contribution due to a meeting with the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Wellbeing. It's an urgent constituency matter and I'm sorry I will miss some of the speeches in today's debate. I want to assure members that no discourtesy is intended to them. The Nobel Prize-winning physicist Isidore Isaac Rabi once said that science is a great game where the playing field is the universe itself, and we know that Scotland has supplied many of the great players on that field, whether it's James Watt, Alexander Fleming, John Logie Baird and James Clerk Maxwell. And just as science played a hugely important part in shaping Scotland's past, it is going to play as big a part in shaping Scotland's future. We all know that we are going through a challenging economic climate, yet despite that the world economy is projected to double in size over the next 20 years, driven by people in countries like China and India becoming consumers for the first time. And when the economic outlook does improve, the big winners are going to be the industrialised countries that create the high value-added products and services and train people who have the highest possible skills, and our science sector is absolutely key to that. Science, engineering and technology-related products and services account for 70% of Scotland's exports, and we can expect that to grow even further in the decades ahead. And beyond the hugely important role of science in our economy, it is the biggest weapon in our arsenal in terms of improving health, improving well-being and quality of life, and tackling the challenges which the world, not just Scotland, face, including tackling climate change, eliminating poverty, fighting disease and hunger, and preserving our environment for future generations. And these are challenges which science must have a major role in tackling. In my own Midlothian constituency alone, the cluster comprising Pentland Science Park, Edinburgh Technopole and Roslin Biocentre, which of course is birthplace to Dolly the sheep, provides over 1,500 highly skilled jobs in world-class research institutes, university and cutting-edge companies. But there is potential to employ thousands more people there and indeed across Scotland. And this SNP government needs to demonstrate leadership if Scotland is to continue to punch above its weight in the science sector. Indeed, Labour finds much to agree with in the SNP government's Science for Scotland strategic framework paper, perhaps because much of the document draws together existing commitments rather than setting out a longer-term policy agenda. However, we are still no clearer about how the SNP will resource their science strategy. We know that universities are absolutely vital to securing the future of our science base, and yet the SNP appears to take our universities for granted. We saw last year a real-term cut in funding for Scottish universities, and to take one example, Dundee University, one of the most respected centres for biomedical research in the UK, Dundee University had to cut more than 100 staff. And it was a decision which the Dundee University principal, Sir Alan Langlands, attributed directly to the SNP government's insufficient funding for higher education. The government's motion talks about Scotland being a magnet for talent and for investment. Absolutely.
I think she might want to revisit the comments, bearing in mind what Sir Alan Langland said subsequently. But does she recognise that the university's share of the UK budget, of the Scottish budget, under this government is actually higher than it was under previous administrations?
And in fact, a real terms cut last year, and of course what university principals are saying is there are very real fears for the future and how Scotland is going to remain competitive going into the future, depending on what happens south of the border. The government's motion talks about Scotland being a magnet for talent and for investment and a powerhouse of technology, innovation and enterprise. And while that appears to be borne out the fact, as we all know, that our higher education institutions receive about 12% of UK research spending, that could decrease if English universities succeed, and some of the English universities succeed in their call for higher university fees south of the border. And we know that Scottish university principals have got very real fears of world-class scientists potentially being attracted to better funded universities south of the border. And there is nothing in the motion or in the Cabinet Secretary's speech today that gives an indication of how the Government would match any increase in resources which English universities might receive, and I hope the Minister will address that point in the summing up. Is it any wonder that Dr Brian Lang, the former Principal at St Andrews University, stated last week in this very building that higher education is not a priority for this Government? Turning to science and schools, the Cabinet Secretary has made much of the proposed Science Baccalaureate, We know the recent trends in international maths and science study, the TIM study, indicates that Scotland is falling behind other countries, particularly in the primary 5 to S2 age bracket. But it's an issue which the Baccalaureate is going to do absolutely nothing to address. And whilst being heralded as something that was going to be special for science, the Minister has since announced that other subjects are going to have the Baccalaureate as well, so rather to the surprise of the science sector. And while the Scottish Government's marketing campaign to encourage young people to study science subjects is well intentioned, it comes at a time when some schools are reducing science options to save money as a result of the appalling local government settlement from the SNP government. And even the slickest marketing campaign does nothing to address the fact that many primary teachers are simply not confident about teaching maths and science. It's a major concern identified in the TIMS report. And if our teachers don't have the confidence or enthusiasm for science subjects, what hope is there then of enthusing a generation of young people? The Government has to come up with a plan to tackle that. We need more science graduates going into primary teaching, for example. The uncertain economic climate, in one sense, presents an opportunity to attract science graduates who were lost to the financial sector, and we may need to encourage more of them to come into teaching. And there are specific plans down south that have been announced to attract graduates, science graduates, from companies who have been made redundant. And indeed, primary pupils should be benefiting more from the expertise of science departments in local high schools. And I hope the Minister will talk in some detail about this when he sums up. And there's work to be done in continuing professional development for teachers of science. While the Scottish Government has provided a grant of £2.1 million for science continuing professional development, it has rolled up £13.5 million of ring-fenced CPD money into the local government settlement. It is clear that the £2.1 million isn't enough to meet demand for the Scottish Schools Science Equipment Research Centres training. All their courses have been fully subscribed in 2008-2009. Indeed, most courses have been oversubscribed by more than 50%. So there is clearly unmet demand there, and I would like to know what the Minister plans to do to address that. Members may be aware that Gordon Brown announced on the 27th of February that UK Government spending on science will be ring-fenced until 2014, safeguarding long-term investment in science despite the obvious short-term funding pressures. And the Prime Minister also committed to boosting investment levels to at least in line with economic growth for the next 5 years. And Gordon Brown is effectively putting science at the heart of the UK's economic growth strategy. We have had warm words for science in the motion and indeed in the Cabinet Secretary's speech today, but there is not an awful lot of beef. Will she put her money where her mouth is today and make the same pledge that Gordon Brown has to ensure that science funding in Scotland is ring-fenced and isn't squeezed? Turning to my amendment, I talked earlier about how Scotland punches above its weight in research funding as part of the UK. Some might suggest it is in the SNP's political interest to allow this union dividend to diminish, since it would make it easier for them to argue the case for an increasingly unpopular independence policy. The Minister indeed smiled wryly when she accused us of making political capital out of constitutional issues. Of course, that is a joke, given that we consistently attack the SNP for doing just that. But it's not a joke. It's not actually a joke. There is genuinely concern amongst Scotland's scientific community about the dangers of any move towards loosening the ties between Scottish institutions and the rest of the UK's science base. Project-based funding, I'd like to finish now, thanks. Project-based funding at our Scottish universities comes largely from UK research councils, and our Scottish institutions play important roles in UK-wide consortia. If SNP members want to do more than pay lip service to Scotland's science sector, I do ask them to put their constitutional dogma to one side and indeed support Scottish expertise and Scottish jobs, and join other members in supporting the amendment in my name.